Hey guys, welcome to another video for Down to Business. Helping a lot of people, but mainly helping small business owners and medium business sized business owners really get ahead with a few tips and tricks that can make your business better, hopefully. So today's a very topical issue that we come across a lot within business, and in modern day. We've got a lot of baby boomers transitioning out of businesses, etc. So it's even more on the mind, I guess. And today I've got Mark Scanlon joining me from Next Rural and also Next Strategic, which are a business that really focus on that whole succession planning, but that specific transitioning of family, of assets, of whatever it may be, but really to help business owners find that exit and still maintain what they're after, both for their family and after they finish their working life, I guess the best way to put it. So welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Andrew.
You might want to give us a bit more of a background. I haven't done probably a very good job there, but on what you do and some of the ways that you found yourself in this specific area of business.
Yeah. Well, my background is like yourself, from the accounting side of things, but early in 2000s, I suppose, recognised where the demographics were headed with succession planning. Obviously, the average age of a business owners these days is late 50s, so we predominantly started to work on the transition with business owners, and the opportunity originally was in the rural sector with farming families, and that's sort of broadened itself out to all family-owned businesses now.
Yeah, no, and I guess that's a bit in the name too. It's the next group, but Next Rural, Next Strategic. I mean, realistically, the good thing there is that whether it is agri, whether it is normal business, whether it's whatever, everyone has a transitional need.
Yeah. I think the issue is always the same, irrespective of the commodity group. But certainly there's a few nuances. I think from our perspective on the Next Rural side of things, it is real intergenerational transfers. So there's a lot of succession planning for the next generation where predominantly other business owners are looking for that exit strategy, as you suggested.
Yeah, and I mean, often, as advisors, we can, I guess, take for granted that everyone understands what succession planning is, what transition planning is. Maybe let's break it down to layman's for the people out there. Give us a bit of an explanation as what is succession planning and, practically what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, I think from our perspective, a transition is really from now to when you go, to be honest with you. So the transition plan itself, we'd argue, has got the succession component, it's got the retirement component, it's got the estate planning component. So they're the three plans that predominantly we'd be working on with family-owned businesses. But within that, there's a number of key transition pillars. So we do look at the transition of management, look at the transition of the business itself, transition of assets, property, the business owner's transition, and then from the family's perspective, making sure that it's all fair and equitable.
Yeah, and I guess, as you said, a lot of the time it is family members, not just a wealth transition, but, you mentioned quite a few things there where it could be business and management are the family, or even where it could be third parties.
Yep, that's correct. Yeah.
So I gather a lot of emotion can come into that.
Absolutely. I think it's the hardest trick in the book, actually, is to get that sort of balance between what the family's trying to achieve, and that's all family members, what the business is trying to achieve and what the owners are trying to achieve. So you've got these three hats on that have all got competing interests, and you're trying to balance that out. And really a successful transition plan is one where you can walk away with all those three groups in sync with each other. And happy family, all family members, a business with a future, and mum and dad, or the owners, exiting gracefully.
And in many cases, I know you get a lot of work off banks, for instance, but in many cases, it's not just the actual transition and making sure everyone's still a happy family afterwards, but it's also third parties and stakeholders.
Correct, yeah. Which, as you go back to our two brands, I suppose, Next Rural, it is predominantly farming families, but Next Strategic is those other businesses, because you may have multiple families involved in that process.
But I guess, and a client of mine once hit it on the head when he said to me, it's, we don't just employ 60 people, we affect and influence 60 families.
Correct.
So it's not just from an ownership group, but it's also, that, I guess, sense of, you've built something pretty special in your business or your net wealth or whatever you're supporting. But sometimes we forget it's all about our exit, but it's also about what happens to those other people that are there as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, there's a number of stakeholders that are going to be impacted in the process, and clearly we've got to make sure we've got a good outcome for all those stakeholders.
Yeah, sure. So talk to me, I mean, we'll get a bit more in the detail of how you work with business owners, but before then, let's talk about succession at a broader scale. I know, and you know, but maybe our viewers don't, that succession planning is probably a bit, and it's probably understated, but a bit neglected in probably world, but let's specifically focus on Australia.
Yep.
Talk to us about that.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think what I'd say there is that years ago, the will was the succession plan. You know, people would look at their estate plans and go, well, I've got something in place there, but now we are trying to move them to the other side of the ledger and commence that process. But there's a number of barriers to entering that process, and I think the fear of loss of control is the number one, which is quite often the reason people don't go down the path of a succession. You know, there's a bit of a misconception that it's a case of, you know, out with the old, in with the new, but it's not that at all. And I think those sort of barriers are an impediment to moving forward.
And ironically, you know, if anything, and from what I've seen in some of your work, this process is all about control.
Yeah.
You know, because realistically, you are, you know, rather than leaving it to chance or what may happen, it's very much a structured, you know, where do we want to be and how do we go about it?
Yeah, and really identifying what that timeline is for the business owners.
Yeah.
Because, you know, release of control can take many forms, as I alluded to before. It could be releasing of the management responsibilities, decision-making powers, etc., but you've still got your hands on the assets. So really it is sitting down with business owners and saying, well, look, control can take many forms, release of control can take many forms. What does that look like for you? Because if you don't do it, inevitably, you know, a crisis event occurs and then you are in a position of, you know, loss of control.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point what you said too about, you know, for years the will was the succession plan, but in reality, as advisors and as I guess consultants, have gotten, let's call it, smarter over the years, and we've come up with these wonderful structures and, you know, things, whether it be for a tax advantage or whether it be for a merger and acquisition or whatever the main reason and driver was, people end up with these convoluted structures and ownership situations that they've got to work through, and a will just doesn't cut it because it only covers really those
when you're gone.
Yeah. Well, and it only covers the assets in your name.
Right, that's correct. Yeah.
So talk. I mean, we've had people on here before from a financial planning point of view, but from your eyes, what's the difference between a will to an estate plan?
Yeah. Well, as you say, you know, quite often the will would just deal with individual assets, where the estate plan can deal with assets that sit outside the will. I mean, everyone's got various structures, but certainly, you know, you look at things like superannuation, for example, sits outside of a will. You look at all the trust structures that people have, sits outside of a will. So there are many assets that are going to transfer that are outside the actual the estate plan itself.
Yeah, and I guess while we're talking mainly about business succession, you've still got to take, as you said, that end day, whenever that may come. You know, you don't want to be, well, I think most people wouldn't want wealth and business issues to be affecting family relationships, etc. So,
No.
So just because you have a will, I think that's a key point I'm trying to get out there. You know, and from your experience, you need to go beyond that more often than not for business owners.
Yeah, I suppose our probably golden rule there is the will's there to deal with the balance of your estate, but it shouldn't be a succession strategy.
Yeah. And on that point, as we said, succession being underdone, you know, I've read a stat, you might have some more update information for me, but I think I read a stat that said, you know, less than 24% of business owners in Australia have a succession plan.
That's correct. Yeah. It's around that figure.
Which is
staggeringly low.
Horrendous. Especially when you just said that most business owners are in their, you know, the average late 50s or mid to late 50s.
Yeah.
It's sort of a counterintuitive.
Yeah. Well, I think my understanding is about $1 trillion worth of wealth is about to change hands in Australia in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
From family-owned businesses.
Huge.
So it's a huge thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, as we said before, you get a lot of your work from, you know, bankers and that sort of thing. Yeah, what are their fears around this space?
Well, I think the key things there is that as the business owners get older, they're carrying the debt, so they need the next generation to come through and have the skills to be able to run that business. So, the banks are very wary of things like succession and been far more focused on it than ever before. So, it's also a client retention strategy in many respects, because they do want to work with the next generation and their families moving forward on their long-term planning.
Yeah, right. Okay. So, you know, we spoke about succession being underdone. We spoke about, you know, it's more than just a will. Practical. Okay. What are some of the things, you know, like right down to a bit more of the minutiae, I guess, what's some of the things you work on and how do you work with, whether it be business owners, their advisors, their teams, their families for that matter, because you get quite involved.
Yeah, we certainly take a collaborative approach to the succession process. I mean, you've got to be multi-skilled for one, but there's so many moving parts in the process that you do need to work with their advisors. So from our perspective, there will be accountants, lawyers, financial planners, bankers, as you suggested, in the overall strategy. So I suppose from our perspective, having that helicopter view, looking down on all that and seeing how all those parts are moving to get the outcomes for the business owners.
So you're a key confidant, I guess, then for the business owners. You're doing very much, by the sound of it, a project management role.
Yeah, and if you go back to what the original comment around the family was, I mean, that's a very big part of what we do is working with all the family members. We can't stress that enough, and I think the one thing that we can provide there, and as part of that teamwork, is the independence of that conversation, because quite often if mum and dad are working with their current advisors, you're probably going to get the current advisor's view on that, where we can sort of provide a little bit more independence at the table. So.
And talk to me about some of the war stories, I guess, that you've learned through dealing with some of these different, whether it be advisors or family members, or the stakeholders.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I think many of them are impacted by their own succession plans before that, with their own parents or family-owned businesses. So quite often that is an impediment to moving forward because they've had a difficult time and a bad experience with it. So, but I think in recent times that's sort of moving towards now wanting to do something with the next generation. I think, if you look at the things like death, divorce, disablement, we call them 3Ds in any transition planning process, they've got to be addressed. And if you want to talk about war stories, a marital breakup for one is always going to cause an impact on the business. So therefore you've got all the asset protection things to consider. A sudden death, those sorts of things will also impact if there's no plan in place.
Yeah, so you raised some good points there. Like, I think for a lot of people, they'd be thinking, okay, I've got a bit of an understanding on succession planning, which means a business exit or a business transition. But as I say, there's a whole lot more to this, and hence we need to be that helicopter view, as you put it. What are some of the other things? Like we've mentioned assets, we've mentioned the business. What else would be in there?
Well, I think if you look at the family level, quite often there's not an appreciation of what people are putting into the business. For example, if you're not in the business or if you're an off-farm person, sometimes you don't actually understand what those people in the business are doing, the sweat for equity or the foregone wages that are very prominent in family-owned businesses. So sometimes there's a misperception of what is actually happening within the business and what's being provided. Everyone sees these people within the business, getting houses, cars, etc., and they think, oh, well, they're all being looked after, but not actually recognising what they're doing to get that.
Yeah. So it's getting that whole truth.
Getting the whole truth and getting it all on the table. So, having what we'd argue in our process, having a very robust discovery phase with all the family members and saying, well, what are your objectives? What are you trying to achieve? And looking at things that have been provided for in the past. And for what's sitting under that table that needs to be put on the table, so we've actually got clear understanding and transparency around the whole family situation.
Yeah, so how does that work? Where you've got maybe some family members that aren't as forthcoming as others when you're doing those discovery sessions. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, so we have a couple of key things there. We have online questionnaires, for example, for people to answer in the comfort of their own home, their own time, etc. So that's less confronting for them. And we also have the face-to-face meetings with them by themselves. So, it's very confidential, those meetings. And in our business model, we don't communicate the outcome of those meetings to the broader group. They stay in-house. But they're the things that we really need to manage.
Yeah, because I had a great comment years ago that said, the death of any good succession plan is pillow talk.
Correct,
it's making sure, from your point of view, who are those people that need to be in that environment or that forum, and making sure that, it's not just the obvious ones, there could be actually other people influencing a decision.
Absolutely, and I think with the pillow talk comment you made, there's always these sort of promises made to people in the business. Don't worry about it, it's all going to be yours in the future, what do you need to do something now for? That doesn't cut the mustard anymore. So you need to be proactive about it.
Yeah, I've seen that, not so much in a succession planning sense, well I guess it is, but the amount of times we've seen people that are not direct family but maybe brothers or brothers and sisters, etc., and they don't worry about a shareholders agreement.
Correct,
and it's family. And, reality is, at some point, something's happened and shit hits the fan. And one comes to mind where it was quite a wealthy family group and quite a sophisticated structure that eventuated. And these brothers had a falling out, a big falling out. That took us 5 years just under 5 years to untangle and get a result. And and at the end of the day, no one was still absolutely happy.
Yep.
But just to get them so they could move on with life. So I guess the importance for me is don't just assume because, like as you're saying, because we're in the family or whatever it may be, that we still don't need structure. We still don't need, plans and guidelines.
Yeah, and all those agreements you're speaking about, shareholders agreements, buy-sell agreements. I mean, you asked the question of a business owner if you have different family groups, for example, if one of them was to suddenly pass away tomorrow and their estate plan said, well, it's going to my spouse, male or female, do you want to be in bed with that spouse from a business point of view moving forward? And quite often the answer to that is no. So, you need to look at that sort of eventuality as well.
Yeah, sure, yeah. And what about from a point of view when, I know the rural space might be a bit different, but general succession planning, we're hearing that more and more next generation don't actually want to come into the family business or take it over. Is that a common trait?
It is a common trait, and probably like most of the next generation these days leave school, go to university, so they have a lot more of that off-farm or off-business experience, and quite often they're very successful with that, so there's no sort of desire to return back to the family business or the farm. So yeah, I think just the sheer education factor that occurs these days is one of the reasons people don't come back, because they can, especially on farms, if you had 5, 6, 7 years of drought, probably going to come back.
And they've probably seen how hard
mum and dad have worked.
Yeah, and as we said before, emotion, like, it's tough work, especially when you things you can't control, like the weather.
Yep.
But I've even seen in other businesses where and they're good businesses, but next gen just goes, well, that's not what I want to do.
Correct.
So how do you?
But I think a lot of that's got to do with not being given the opportunity to do what they want to do as well.
Okay, good point.
So, which goes back to the point that the misconception about transition succession is an asset transfer. It doesn't have to be just the assets. It can be management, decision-making protocols, etc. And how do you take the next generation from an employee or a worker to the general manager of the business? And that's really what you're trying to achieve in the first instance of any transition plan, because why would you hand the assets over to someone who haven't got the ability to run the business?
And what do you do there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So that's actually sitting down and from our perspective, getting a family business charter sorted. What's the rule book?
So what's a family business charter? Because that's probably a new term that most people wouldn't know.
Yeah, so family business charter is sitting down with a family and creating, I suppose, what we'd argue is the family DNA. What's the rule book? How does this family wish to operate? So you'd have two components. So that would be the family council. So all family members could be a part of that. Creating mission statements, vision statements, and the like. How we want to be recognised in a family, our values, beliefs, etc. As distinct from the business side of the charter, which is more around decision-making protocols. So what decisions get made at management level, what decisions have to be made at the board level, or maybe there's a right of veto from mum and dad or the business owners on certain decisions. So once you've got that family business charter, that really is your management transition tool to move forward. And everyone knows what those rule books are, and that really helps, I think, ultimately in the transition. Yeah,
right. So there's a fair bit of complexity there. I mean, most families wouldn't.
Most families
even without business could probably deal with one of those, but myself included. But when we look at then, okay, say you've got that in place, and you say you want to start to transition some of that management responsibility. I'd imagine you get involved or start to set up some sort of development plan for gaps of skill sets.
Gaps, skills analysis. Just because you're the eldest in the family doesn't mean to say you're going to be the future CEO either, by the way. So it's actually identifying who is the successor or successors in that business. To go back to my point before about people going to university, people go off and do marketing degrees, finance, economics, whatever it might be, business management. So they've all got these different skill sets, and when they return to the business, how do you incorporate those skills into the business moving forward? So it's identifying, I suppose, from the next generation perspective, who is the successor or successors moving forward. And that's why we use the word transition, because you've got to start this planning process now. You really do. I mean, you could be talking about plans that will take 5, 10, 15 years to complete. So we'd also say to any business owner, it is not a case of, out with the old, in with the new. We are going to sit down with you and map this out over a 5, 10, 15, 20-year period. And ultimately, to go back to what we were saying before, your will deal with the balance of your estate assets when you're gone, but there's a lot of assets we need to deal with in that time frame.
Well, and there's for most, there's a lifestyle they've got to maintain.
Absolutely.
They've become very used to a certain way of living. I don't imagine people want to go back here, bread and butter and beans. It's making sure that they can still, in many cases, that business can still provide for the wider family.
Absolutely, and I think all business owners are faced with this scenario that the most of their wealth is in the business. I mean, you ask a lot of business owners, have you got superannuation? And the answer to that's no. Our super's the business. Look at farms, the super's in the dirt. So how do you extract that wealth out over a period of time is really what we're trying to sit down and work out with mum and dad, because that in itself is a process.
Yeah, and I guess I want to come back to the time one, but like some of the stats you've put out there, $1 trillion worth of wealth transitioning, the amount of people in their late 50s, the numbers we're saying that haven't got a succession plan. Like, these are some, pretty alarming, stats. And I think the thing that I've seen, like I do a lot in the M&A space, mergers and acquisitions, and you're looking at for how long, realistically, it's been a seller's market. Sellers can get a pretty good result, but with those sort of statistics, it could very much become a buyer's market. So if you want to get a good result, you can't sort of leave it until you're ready to hang the shingle,
I think one of the things with mum and dad's retirement transition is sitting down, and there's an enormous amount of vendor finance in these transactions. The next generation just don't have the capacity to go to the bank, borrow the money and cut mum and dad a cheque. So, they invariably take over the existing debt, but there's still this big gap of the assets that mum and dad have got as well, the net asset position. So the vendor finance discussion is paramount in the transition process.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned time, and you said 5, 10, 15, etc. On average, I think some very sage advice is, back in the day, when you get into business, you should have an exit plan, or you shouldn't go into anything without an exit. But rarely does that play out practically.
Yeah.
What's the average, I guess, tenure or period of time before an actual event do you get involved with most businesses?
As soon as we can. Yeah, absolutely. It's never too early to start the process, because if it's not a transition of assets, it will be a transition of management or people. It's simply that. So from our perspective, the earlier we can get in with these families and business owners, the better from our perspective.
And I guess if they've got more time, it's less intense and well, maybe not less intense in some of the conversations, but there's less pressure on meeting milestones, and we can plan out a bit longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'd sit down and work those time frames out with mum and dad. And I mean, if you would sort of look at some averages, when does the next generation take over the running of the business? Now, there's a strong argument it should be some of the age around 30 to 35 years of age is when they should be sort of putting the general manager's hat on many of these businesses, because mum and dad then are at their late 50s, early 60s. So you do have to work through that process. So we talk about a 5-year block now of knowledge transfer, skill transfer, financial management, all those sorts of things. If you look at business owners and who's doing the books, that in itself is another transition area that needs to be addressed.
And I guess it's not, even if they're not doing it specifically, whether it be mum and dad or the owners, obviously have built relationships up with various advisors, confidants, etc. They need to transition those relationships as well, or help next gen establish
their own.
New,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, which doesn't happen overnight.
No, that certainly doesn't happen overnight. No.
We've spoken a lot about mum and dad, and I guess a family transition, and that's not every option. So talk a bit more about some of the other options that are out there for business owners. Say, for instance, that the family doesn't want to do that transition. I mean, I'm talking more business specific now.
Yeah, so now you're getting the business prepared for sale.
Yeah,
that's really what we're addressing here, and you find with many business owners, if the key person went, what's the business really worth?
Yeah,
there's a strong argument that suggests it's not worth a lot, and the purchaser's looking at this business and saying, well, if that business owner is exited tomorrow, what is the real value? So that's a strong point for us, is to sit down with the business owners and say, well, what's up here? We need to document that. Get policies and procedures documented so someone can come in.
It's your IP.
It's your IP, yeah. And most business owners don't actually document that IP. As you say, they've got all their contacts and knowledge, etc. But, it's a strong thing to sit down and say, well, if you're going to exit the business, what's your time frame? Once again, it could be 3, 5, 10 years, but we've got to start to put those policies and procedures in place now and document that. So when someone comes in, a turnkey operation, those structures are in place.
Yeah, we often refer to that as the big red bus policy.
Yeah.
And for that, I mean, it's great planning for that transition, but you never know what's around the corner at any given time. So that's a great practice to get into, at any point. But okay, so we're getting business ready for sale.
Yeah, there's other things like joint ventures arrangements. I mean, joint ventures are becoming very common these days, where you might want to partner with someone to take on a project or just grow your business with the view that your joint venture partner may be your buyer at the end of the day as well. So there's a lot of stuff around, what you say, mergers and acquisitions, etc. So from our perspective, if it's going to be a sale, get it ready for sale. But it may not always be that case. It may be that there is still a significant amount of growth in the business, but the incumbent owners may, in their mind, be running out of time to have the energy and the passion to continue to do that. So, those sorts of things.
Yeah, we've seen it. I agree with you. We've seen a lot of that where, you could have been effectively competing with various business for a long time, but then they could be your best exit. Suppliers, customers, complementary businesses, etc. And I think for most of those businesses, they'd not only want to see the process, as you said, but they'd also like to see the business owners working with them for a while, transitioning that goodwill, transitioning that contact base. And that's hard. If you've been running your own show for a while, actually now starting to have to check in with other people around agreeing to directions and that sort of stuff, I know that can be very hard.
It's a bit like the dating period before the marriage in that sense. So, it's true though. I mean, it's a very important component of getting, I suppose, some complementary visions and skill sets as well in all of that.
Yeah. So I might just recap on a couple of those points. It's not always about the family business, from a business sense. It could be sale readiness, and then you've really got to sit there and think about what I need to do to make sure that if I take me out of the business, it's still a business, Correct. It still operates. There'd be some key people around that, being other advisors, etc., stakeholders that we need to make sure those relationships are transition.
Yep.
And when to start on that, well, the sooner the better.
Yep.
And I think that point's very valid. It's not just because you're getting sale ready, doesn't mean you're selling. It means you're in a position, should something happen, that the business is pretty sound. And I guess the other way to look at that, in the meantime, while you're getting that ready, has to improve your business and your ongoing earnings, etc., year on year. So, Mate, one for you. You've been in there doing this for a while. Would have seen a lot of different, shapes, sizes, issues, etc. What are some of the maybe hardest, but really good lessons you've learned personally, not only working with business owners, but being in business as well?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's a summary of all the things we've discussed today in terms of actually having some clear direction as to where you are wanting to go. Sometimes I think you don't actually sit down and smell the roses. You're pedaling so fast every day that you actually don't sit back and catch your breath and say, well, where do we wish to go into the next sort of period of time, 5, 10 years, whatever it might be. But from my perspective, even in our own business, you've just got to move with the times. And I think one of the things I've always said to business owners, it's your plan too, it's not our plan. We have our own views about these things and we can give you some ideas and some key considerations, but ultimately it's your plan and we can't put a round peg in a square hole, so to speak, with this. So you've got to own your plan. We've got to make sure the business owners own their plan as well. And I think that's a pretty strong thing that we would get across to the business owner, is that we can come in as advisors and give you some tools and tips and some considerations, and some of those are at a personal level, some of those are at a business level, tax, etc. But at the end of the day, own your own plan. Tell us what you're trying to achieve, and let us assist you get there. Yeah,
and I think that's a really good point. I think the other side of that is they own the plan, but having someone external can really help them push through when it gets hard, because I don't think any of this is easy. It might be easy if you got may not be if you've got no family to give it to, etc. But generally, you're dealing with people, you're dealing with emotion, you know.
Right.
So it's never going to be easy. And rather than just go look at a too hard basket, bring in somebody like yourself to help them just keep moving forward. You know, may take a bit longer. Likewise with our own businesses, you know, we're the same. We've got someone that comes in on us because that independence and external view, someone who's not necessarily in the emotion, can really help push through some of those hard points. Yeah,
and one of the things that's become very common these days is to create these board structures, whether they're family boards or just boards in general. You know, many business owners initially are against that concept. Don't tell me how to run my business. But, you know, creating family boards is quite powerful these days. Getting independent people to come in, chair those boards, give them some thoughts and ideas as to what's happening out there, because quite often you don't know what's happening out there. You're in your own little patch. But as advisors, and when we're exposed to so many different businesses and so many different circumstances, it's pretty powerful to come in and say, well, have you thought about this, for example?
Yeah, it's a great point. And you know, you don't know everything.
No, I don't know everything.
No one does. And you only know what you know. So I think not only bringing in people with potential skill sets, but people of different demographic diversity. You know, like you can get some wonderful views. You just go, you're right, I'd never considered that. And it could be very advantageous to, you know, the business, but also the family situation or individuals themselves.
So to pick up on your point, don't discount anything. Like, you know, you might think that you know everything, but you don't. It's pretty hard. You might know your industry back to front, inside out, but there's many other things that you may not be aware of, external forces. So, and you know, sometimes there's reasons why you can't transition to, and I mean, without being putting the accountant's hat on too strong, they're tax driven too. I mean, there's lots of things to consider in terms of, you know, capital gains tax is a big thing in any sale of a business. So, you know, there's impediments to doing things now. You might have to wait 2, 3, 4 years, but find that out now.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's a very good point. Because what you think you might have in your hand isn't necessarily what you will have in your hand. One of the other things I want to touch on before we start to summarise, but you know, I think a lot of people think succession planning is just about that retirement and business sale, etc. But there's a massive, I guess, mental play for when someone's been doing something for so long. What about after the fact? So, what do you do? Do you do anything in that space where you know, to help people?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that, you know, I think particularly in farming, this is a very good example of that. Is that, you know, they'd probably never retire, to be honest with you. And I think from our perspective is defining, what does retirement mean? I mean, it doesn't mean that you actually stop work, to be honest with you. You may still be consulting back to that business 2 days, 3 days, whatever it might be a week. You might go to the coast for, you know, 3 or 4 weeks a year. You know, I know with our farming clients, if you get 2 days away a year, it's probably a holiday for them. But so from our perspective, it's really defining what retirement means. But we make it very clear to business owners, retirement doesn't mean you've hung the boots up and you've stopped. If you want to, you can, but 9 times out of 10, that's not the case. So it's a real key thing from our perspective to sit down, mum, dad, business owners, and say, well, what does that really mean for you, this retirement thing? Yeah,
because I think you'd said probably more than I do, but so many people, their identity is their business.
It is,
or what they do, their job, day in, day out. And, you know, you take that away. What do I do? Who am I? And I know I might be getting a bit Dr. Phil here, but you know, reality that's a big part of it. And I think the other aspect is it's, you know what, I've had all these business relationships, but I haven't seen my spouse for that much for how many years. And now all of a sudden I'm spending all this time. So, you know, if I was my wife, she'd probably say, get out of the house, you know, but what do you do in that space?
Yeah, well, it's very common, I would say, more common than not, that you know, mum and dad are sitting there and dad's got a different view to mum on what this actual transition or future looks like, because mums quite often, particularly in farming families, have sat there and you know, dad's been working 24/7 for 60 years. So we need to sort of bridge that gap between, I suppose, expectations on mum's side and dad's side and that retirement journey moving forward. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things to do, really, is to break that cycle from where they are now to where they can be. But to get back to one of our initial points, the earlier you do that, the better.
Yeah, I can see that.
And I can assure you that if you're in your 70s, that's a much harder exercise when you're in your late 50s, early 60s. And I think if we can capture those people a little bit earlier in the process, and get them to understand that, if you can transition the business to the next generation or within other owners within the business from a management and ownership perspective, sooner rather than later the better. And a good structure quite often is to say, well, have the next generation run the business, but you might still be the landlord. There's plenty of things where
still be involved.
You still own the dirt, so to speak, but the next generation owns the business and runs the business. So you're a landlord on one side, and coming back and consulting to the business on the things you wish to do.
And I think, come back to the relationship piece. I think I love what you said about giving yourself time. Like the one common thread, if I like, through all these series of videos we've been doing with different advisors, etc., to help business owners, it's give yourself time and have a plan. And really, that's one of your key points you're getting at here. But to me, most business owners, we go into it and we say we're doing this for the family. Then the part of coming out relationships, you'd hate that the lack of a good plan or the lack of time and pressure actually ruins what you have of the family and what you've been trying to work for.
Yeah, I think also, there is a big push from the next generation at the moment to get their hands on the steering wheel a little bit quicker than probably in the past. So, and I think there needs to be acknowledgement of that from mum and dad's side of things. And things are changing out there, and I mean the attitudes to sort of waiting around are gone. Certainly when I started this up sort of 15 years ago, the next generation coming through would wait, because that was the normal course of events. But these days, it's not quite that easy.
Well, I guess they're access to information sooner, more educated, their own ideas, and I sit on quite a good school board up here, and you're seeing what's coming through in younger and younger age children.
Yep.
They want to apply that, so I can see where it can actually, the old versus new can start to get a bit clouded.
And let them apply it.
Yeah.
Because you might lose them.
Yeah. That's a good point.
That's the point. Yeah.
Well, the one thing that we do know is, whether you're a large business, a small business, a medium-sized business, or just a good-sized family that's got wealth transition, we can't avoid this. At the end of the day, we've got a lifespan. We get older. This is something that's going to happen. So, I think when people are watching this, could be like, it's not happened to me. There might be some other areas they can have that argument, but not in succession or transitional planning. Well, sorry, not in succession or transitions. The planning side is probably the difference which makes you successful or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of our comments there, if you want your ultimate wishes to be achieved, generally that can't happen through your estate plan or your will, because you've gone, you've lost control. Contesting your wills is a big thing too. So don't discount that may happen, is what we say to business owners.
Plan for it. Yep.
Yeah.
Mate, I might just start to wrap up and see if you've got any final comments, but I mean, again, these topics we get into, we can talk about all day. Succession's such a big topic, but also very topical at the moment. As we said, so as you're saying, most business owners, in the mid to late 50s and need to be thinking about this. When do you start? The sooner the better. Give yourself time. Make sure you know who should be involved from a family point of view. Use people like yourselves for independence and help drive that process when it maybe get a bit harder, and also know who to pull in and who to not. Involve your advisors, and that's probably one of the key points you're saying there. Don't just think about the business. There's asset transition, management transition, decision-making transition. I love what you raised about the family council and the family charter and that sort of thing, and I might put that on my own to-do list to go home and get this done. But some of the things you mentioned about what are the options out there, and you need to take into account other stakeholders such as employees, such as banks, for argument's sake, whoever may be affected by this. It may not just be you. So again, that time aspect is a key part. You mentioned about some of the things you can get involved with not everyone wanting to come forward and put their full contribution in. So there's other means that you go through from a point of view of some surveys, some one-on-ones, and some just in a general family situation. And the other key point is understanding what your options are from a point of view of taxation, or have you got people coming through from a family, or is it an alternative? And knowing all that information earlier so you can start to plan for that.
Absolutely.
Any other key points that we might have missed there that you want to contribute from a
No, I think that's a really good summary. And from our perspective, as I said earlier, if we can walk away with the family, the business and the owners all in sync with each other, we've got a successful transition plan. And we do, you know, I often say from a family perspective that equal's not going to be fair. We just need to get that fair outcome for them.
Yeah. No, that's great. I think for the viewers, you know, like if you've got a business, you know, which is mainly the audience we're talking to, but you know, don't be one of those statistics that are in that 24%, you know, of people that have got succession plans. If you want a successful outcome, if you want to make sure you actually do have control, or as much control as you can over the process, get a plan in place sooner rather than later. I mean, this is the ultimate working on the business rather than getting stuck in it, because this is, as I say, we said before, the big red bus policy, like this is really where we need to spend some time, and unfortunately there's not enough people to do it. You know, I've worked with Mark and from the Next Rule and Next Strategic guys, and you know, they're very top level, so you know, reach out if there's a process there to have a look at and explore a bit further. If you've been unsure, it's definitely one you can't neglect. So
and one last thing I would say, document your plan.
Yeah.
Document it, you know, and that really means formalising it in some sort of a deed of family arrangement or something like that, because that does become then your review point for these plans.
No, that's great. Mate, as I said, we could talk about this all day, but I really do appreciate you giving a bit of insight into a topic that I know is always one that's of interest. You've probably opened our eyes into a few different points there, so thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it.
And until the next video series rolls around, we'll say cheers and thanks for joining us at Down to Business.